I'm Ari Rebord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, we're going to be talking to CoinDesk's reporter Nick Day about covering the cryptocurrency space. But first, inside the lab. Recently, TRM's blockchain intelligence team released our illicit crypto economy report, Key Trends from 2023. Inside the lab is going to be looking at different trends from that report. Today, we're talking about hacks. In 2023, hack proceeds fell by over 50% to $1.8 billion from $3.7 billion in 2022. Actors linked to North Korea, responsible for nearly a third of all funds stolen in crypto attacks, made off with 30% less than they did in 2022. So what are we saying essentially? We're saying that hacks are down by half in 2023 from 2022, and that North Korea itself, which is one of the largest perpetrators of hacks in the space, were able to steal 30% less in 2023 than they did in 2022. So let's talk about the why of that. First of all, we've seen law enforcement, quite frankly, get better at using tools like TRM to track and trace the flow of funds, essentially adding friction to the laundering process. So you'll see North Korea having attacked, the Harmony Bridge or Atomic Wallet. Even a year after that attack, they'll still be laundering the funds because it's harder and harder to move those funds on chain and ultimately find off ramps. And law enforcement has gotten a lot better at tracing and tracking and ultimately potentially blocking, seizing those funds back. So the law enforcement is a key piece to all of this. Better cyber controls. In some respects, when you start tracing transactions, you've lost. The key is to keep those horses in the barn. And we are seeing better cybersecurity controls built, whether it's at large exchanges or even sort of smaller DeFi protocol today. There's obviously a long way to go there. It's absolutely critical. We're seeing regulation globally in a way that's really, really critical. I talked a moment ago about those off-ramps. The reality is you still can't buy many things with cryptocurrency today, so North Korea and other illicit actors are looking for off-ramps. Many times in the North Korea context, those are Chinese OTC brokers and other sort of places with less compliance controls. But the large exchanges where much of the liquidity exists today have robust compliance controls in place. They're using TRM. They have teams of compliance professionals. They have policies and procedures. They're responding to law enforcement. So hardening those off-ramps is also sort of a critical piece to that. So look, we'll continue to see North Korea attack the crypto ecosystem because for them, it's bank robbery at the speed of the internet, right? They can steal funds now in ways that they never could before. In the age of the internet and North Korea hacks and other hacks, it was the loss of usernames and passwords. In the age of crypto, it's funds. So we're going to see North Korea continue to attack, but we're also going to see the tools get better to trace. We're going to see cyber controls get better, and we're going to continue to see regulation at those on and off ramps. So it'll be interesting to see what we're going to see for 2024. All right, now let's sit down with CoinDesk's Nick Day. Today, I have a very special guest, Nick Day of CoinDesk's. Nick is really one of the critical voices of news in our space. Thank you so much for joining TRM Talks.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about sort of the hottest issues of the day in the crypto space because you write about all of them. But before we sort of jump in there, how did you get to this place where you've become a real voice in the space?
Really, it was kind of an accident. So my background is kind of, more general tech science type reporting, but I landed at CoinDesk's as my first, real job and covering crypto in the heyday of the 2017, 2018 cycle. That was really the first time Bitcoin got close to $20,000. And that was immediately followed by everything crashing, the ICO crackdown by the US Securities and Exchange Commission. And covering that, I think, really gave me some very important experience in following just crypto at a point when it was getting kind of big, but it was still not quite so big that everyone had, a reporter or a beat assigned to it. Of course, there was a push for exchange traded funds. So, we're talking in February 2024, just weeks after the SEC finally approved ETFs. But, those ETF applications and the rejections back in 2018 were really how I got into covering regulatory issues. And so it's been kind of surreal watching those things finally get a stamp of approval, begrudging though it might have been, from the federal agency tasked with really overseeing some chunk of the crypto sector.
It's interesting. I think you're raising an important point, and that is it's a unique industry. And maybe because it's so nascent, maybe because there's so many people who are like interested in it, but regulatory issues have become the major news stories over the last few years, which is a little surprising, especially, I mean, regulation is not always the most interesting topic, but somehow crypto Twitter and CoinDesk and others have made it interesting. How do we find ourselves in a place where regulatory stories are big news?
At least as far as CoinDesk and my journey there goes, I have to credit my bosses at CoinDesk for really allowing me to kind of lean into covering regulatory issues. But when I started, there really wasn't a lot of it. It was just kind of, oh, the government's trying to block Bitcoiners from doing something. And that was, I think, kind of the extent of the conversation. But as ETFs became more important or the conversation became bigger, people started looking at the other things. So then we started having, derivatives products, the CFTC approved futures. Then Treasury Department's sanctions watchdog, OFAC, suddenly said, oh, by the way, we might put crypto addresses on our blacklist. And then they did so. And so, we've seen kind of this regulatory environment become more engaged with crypto. And that, I think, helped CoinDesk become, put CoinDesk in a position to better cover it. And so when I started, we didn't have a regulatory beat. Then for a while, it was just kind of me. And now CoinDesk has an entire team that is focused on regulatory issues around the world. And that, I think, reflects the fact that regulators are paying more attention. Obviously, the other thing I have to really give a shout out to is when Facebook announced the Libra project back in 2019. Everyone was out here saying like, oh no, Facebook's trying to take over money. That's it. We're off to races.
It's such an interesting point and just adds so much more, I think, to that, the Libra story, right? For me, I was at the US Treasury Department when Libra launched, and I can tell you it was very much alarm, right? We got on a plane with the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. We went to Switzerland to meet with regulators there, always talking about anti-money laundering, reached out to Libra. They basically changed their entire team to meet the expectation of Treasury Department. It was a watershed. And when I talk about Libra, I talk about it very much as that. It's such an important chapter that got regulators focused on this, right? 250, 300 million users with access to peer-to-peer value transfer at the speed of the internet. But I think what the angle you're bringing to it is so interesting too, because it wasn't just from a regulatory perspective, but it was a huge news story that really sort of blew up crypto in the space.
Before that, the crypto story was really speculation and hype and, the occasional, whatever, Silk Road or Bitcoin Pizza. There were these stories, but it wasn't really seen as the super important thing outside of those circles that were already paying attention. So, for example, if you're following WikiLeaks pre-Libra, you probably knew about Bitcoin. But after Libra, it became a story for everyone. Seeing stories from news organizations that previously did not really care about crypto. So that was kind of the tipping point for a large chunk of the world in a way that we hadn't seen before. And, we're still seeing kind of the reverberations because as we speak, like Treasury Secretary Jenny Yellen is testifying about the need for stablecoin legislation. That was a thing that pre-Libra, no one, like this is a Libra thing.
Miko was written entirely to address Libra, which is wild.
Yeah.
What are you excited about now? Like what gets your pen out to write about sort of the regulatory landscape?
The big one on my mind right now is just kind of the fact that every other week you hear about another hack of some DeFi project and millions or tens of millions of dollars worth of crypto stolen. And that's something that, we know regulators are paying more and more attention to and starting to talk about more and more. We haven't seen any kind of, super concrete action. We've seen, for example, from the US, calls from the Treasury Department for companies to get their act together and try and secure some of these projects, as well as a request to Congress for some greater authorities or greater ability to tackle these kinds of threats. But where Libra was in the first, let's say year after it was announced. I think that's where we are as far as regulators looking at DeFi. And so I'm really curious to see how that shakes out. If in a few years we're going to hear the Treasury Secretary testifying in front of Congress about the need for legislation to address that, if something will have been done. So that's one of the things I'm really curious about. Another is this is an election year. There's elections, not just in the US, but we're looking at potential elections in the UK if that's confirmed. We're looking at elections in the EU happening, next couple of months. We just had an election in El Salvador. There's elections in India. So all these jurisdictions are going to elect or re-elect leaders who are, if not outright campaigning on crypto, at least thinking about it. And so just tracking what the industry is going to look like and how it's going to engage with the campaigns over the next, year or so, I think is going to be really interesting, really important.
Digging in a little bit to that, because it's really, really interesting. I mean, how have you seen crypto in the sort of election conversation over the last year or so? How do you see it, the sort of bigger picture? How do you see candidates over the course of the next year or so talking about cryptocurrencies?
So far, I think it's just been kind of like a sideline issue. So you've seen candidates who, to put it politely, are not going to be president of the United States, for example, talking about it. There was a candidate forum last year where a couple candidates, Asa Hutchinson, Vivek Ramaswamy, Dean Phillips, all talked about crypto. And so it's really interesting that they weren't talking about crypto at all, let alone appearing at a crypto event to talk about crypto policy. I don't think it's going to be a general campaign issue, but the fact that it is of such an importance that at least someone is talking about it is interesting. And of course, the bigger question is going to be if we start hearing about potential, for example, cabinet nominations in the US. Because let's face it, that's where we're really going to see any kind of action happen. Back when we had the Trump versus Biden campaign in 2020, near the end of 2020, there was that proposed wallet rule by then Secretary Stephen Mnuchin that, raised a lot of alarm bells. Over the last year, we've seen, proposed rules from the SEC chair, Gary Gensler, addressing everything from custody to different issues. So I think those are where we're really going to be seeing what the importance of the next campaign is. At this point, I think I'm just watching for the actual engagement from the industry. And in other places like the EU, I think it's a little bit more clear because, Mika, as you mentioned, is a thing that's been signed. It's an effect.
Ultimately, like, is there any administration that's good for crypto, or are we just in a world where it's a tough sell at the moment?
I will say what's kind of been interesting to me is seeing kind of what's inspiring these rules. So, the mixer rule, for example, a lot of that seems to stem from issues that we've seen over the last year, where in 2022 and 2023, OFAC sanctioned mixers that were being used by North Korea and other entities to launder proceeds from, hacks and stuff. And so, this goes back to will DeFi and DeFi hacks be an issue that Treasury Secretary is going to be testifying about in a couple of years? And I don't want to say, this is on the crypto industry. It's got to be a dialogue. I don't think it can be a one-way thing. But as far as the crypto industry goes, they do need to maybe at least acknowledge where these rules are coming from and then go into, taking a look at how to address what might be harmful rulemaking for the industry or for specific projects in the industry.
Let's talk hacks in North Korea in particular. You have the national security piece, which is what a lot of folks are talking about on Capitol Hill, right? Look, North Korea is not just a bunch of hackers in their mom's basement, right? They're stealing funds to be used for weapons proliferation, but there's also the crypto ecosystem piece. What I say to people all the time is like, I'm a former national security prosecutor. Like, these are the issues I care deeply about. But even if you don't, and you love this crypto ecosystem and you believe in the promise of decentralized finance, no one's going to put their money on a protocol or a bridge, right? If North Korea is going to steal it.
I personally agree completely, 100%. If I'm out here and I'm thinking, oh, I want to invest in this project or I want to play around with the tools on this project, and I hear, oh, someone stole 600 million from them, I would probably be a little bit more wary of doing so. Especially right now, I think we're still in a place where, for better or worse, and probably for worse, but most of DeFi is going to be painted as this kind of one uniform thing. Different projects are not really going to be afforded the privilege of being distinguished from other projects. At least right now, I think we're still a bit too early for that. But if these hacks continue, yeah, I think it's absolutely a danger for people who are thinking, oh, this is interesting, but my money's going to be stolen and I'm going to lose my life savings.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Moving on to, I hate that this is true, but I think probably the biggest story in crypto, maybe ever, but certainly over the last few years, was the collapse of FTX. And you became a courthouse reporter, which I absolutely loved and will be eternally grateful to you for. But you were there every day, right? Dawn till dusk. What were your big takeaways from the trial? But I'd also love to hear like your experience as a courthouse reporter.
Being a courthouse reporter was fun. So there were a group of reporters who, from various outlets, we would convene every morning. I will say there were a couple days where I got there a little bit later. And because the court doesn't open until 8 o'clock or so, and you don't even get allowed into the courtroom or the overflow rooms until 9.
And the 4 a.m. is just to start lining up. That's essentially what this was, right?
Yeah, basically people were coming early to make sure they either had a seat in the courtroom itself because there are only about, I think, 10 seats open to press in the main courtroom, or at least in the overflow rooms, the seats were kind of split into two sections. So if you were an overflow room, you could have one of the jury box seats, which had a video monitor, or you were in the general gallery seats where they had like two TVs that were kind of small on in the front, but you couldn't otherwise really see what was going on. A lot of us came early to make sure we had access to either the main courtroom or to one of the better seats with a personal monitor, just to make sure we could see what was going on and report back. And in my case, do some very terrible sketches. It was a very interesting experience. Honestly, I was a little sad after it ended because it was very abrupt. The reporting part of it, of course, was also kind of it was really interesting because first off, this is not the first trial I've covered, but it really hammers home that nothing you do online is private. They were putting up DMs from Twitter, they were putting up emails, they were putting up locations from cell phone like tracing. Prosecutors had a whole bunch of information that I think people don't normally think about as being public information, but it's all public.
What were the big takeaways from you having been on the ground there from the trial?
Probably the biggest one is it really does seem like it would be very difficult to genuinely commit crimes and get away with them. I think that's probably the takeaway the DOJ would like me to come up with. But
Yeah.
yeah, there really was just a lot of information. So this was a roughly 1 month trial. That includes the weekends and days we weren't in session. But in that month, we had over half a dozen witnesses, people talking about, okay, here were the financial records. Here's how we came up with them. The fact that Sam Bankman-Fried's key lieutenants were all, government witnesses. So his former fellow C-level executives really hammered home that, if you're going to commit crimes, don't tell other people to do so and then leave them in a position where they're better served by attorney. Also, just the fact that, people really invested with relatively little due diligence. I wrote a newsletter in the middle of the trial. We had a couple witnesses say, "Oh, yeah, we saw some of these documents and then that was it. We were perfectly willing to invest a lot of money into this company." And those documents had been doctored by one of the executives at Alameda or FTX. They weren't fully truthful. Apparently, these companies were not. They were putting money in or loaning money to FTX and Alameda without properly audited financial statements or without doing too much due diligence beyond, oh, well, it's an exciting guy and, he's got a lot of money and people seem to trust him. So we'll trust him too. That I think might have been the biggest, most stunning thought for me to have is, okay, so if this is the kind of due diligence you're doing on this company, what are you doing with other companies that you're investing in? How much of the money that is flowing around the crypto ecosystem right now is safe? That one's kind of lingered for a while, I have to admit.
Interesting. I'd say that like for me, and again, like not having been there every day, the whole thing, it was the speed that was just an enormous takeaway. Again, having been a prosecutor for a really long time, I have never seen a complex financial crime case move as quickly. And then you throw all kinds of curveballs in there and it still moved quickly, right? You had an extradition. Those could take years. And granted, he waived it eventually, right? Or within 24 hours or so. You had 3 cooperating witnesses. That takes time to get them to plead and cooperate and all that information. You had mountains of evidence, right? Millions and millions of pages and billions of transactions. And then ultimately you had a trial, which you almost never have in these cases because the stakes are so high. And you still, within a year of the collapse, the actual, let's say, the offense, when people learned of the crime, to a guilty verdict, it was about a year. That's unprecedented.
It was exactly a year because I remember because it was the 1 year anniversary of my colleague Ian Allison publishing the balance sheet that led this whole thing to, get in motion. And obviously internally we were saying like, oh wow, that's in the morning we were like, oh, that would be a really interesting coincidence if that verdict came out today. And then it did. You're right. It was
Yeah, even
super
deliberation.
fast.
Even the fact that the deliberations was fast, like, everything about it was really extraordinary, and I think the judge moved things along very quickly. I think, quite frankly, he was motivated to go to trial because he was held. All kinds of factors played in. The prosecutors obviously had a very strong case and had it together. All right, so sketches. As someone who has been butchered by a number of different courtroom sketch artists over the years, my bald alien-looking head has never been done well. So just for our listeners, Nick was doing every day these really great sketches, and the cool thing about them was that they were on legal paper, which I think just added to the whole thing, right? I mean, just had that feeling of you just sitting there knocking these out in the courtroom. But like, tell me about that. A, how did you come up with that? And B, do you sketch?
I do not. So I guess I should disclaim up front, none of the sketches that I have, made bear any resemblance to the people I was sketching. So my apologies to the various, witnesses, the attorneys, the defendants, etc. They would not recognize themselves, I think, if they looked at those sketches. But no, it's I think I was talking with a colleague about the official sketches before the trial began, and then I was there, every day of the trial, and there's a lot of talking, and not all of that talking is useful for a news story. Yeah, if you look at what CoinDesk's published over that month, we had a daily newsletter. We had, I think, a daily wrap up each and every single day. And then sometimes we had a couple other stories. That is us summarizing roughly 8 to 10 hours of testimony and everything every day. There were times when I was just sitting there thinking, there's nothing I need to write down about this. This is not something that's going to make a news story or make an analysis, whatever. This is not going to appear in the story. So I just kind of sketched, whatever I saw on the screen. So sometimes that was, Sam Bankman-Fried. Sometimes that was the witness. Sometimes that was, one of the attorneys. Certainly in the beginning, it wasn't something I was really thinking about. Near the end, I kind of thought, oh, well, might as well just keep up the streak.
It became kind of a real thing. Like, so for our listeners, and this is worth sort of Googling because it's a really interesting thing, the sort of history of, cameras in the courtroom and sort of the sketches. And, cameras have always been barred from federal courts. Different state courts over the years, most famously Judge Lance Ito in the O.J. Simpson case allowed cameras in the courtrooms, which tend to cause a huge circus, right? You have witnesses getting their hair and makeup done for these things. But federal courts have always sort of kept cameras out. So there's this whole cottage industry of courtroom sketch artists, some very, very famous and will sell their art for, all kinds of money. But Nick was sort of that version on crypto Twitter. Like every day, the sketches that were shared widely on Twitter were not the fancy ones by the artist. They were yours. I mean, was that like a surreal kind of thing for you?
Yeah, so I sent the first one into the Coindesk Slack, kind of as a joke, being like, oh, well, here's what's happening. So, in addition to what you said about no cameras being allowed in the courtroom, the judge that was overseeing Sam Bankman-Fried's case, Judge Lewis Kaplan, also forbade any kind of electronic devices. So we didn't even have phones or anything. So I sent it in, then I put my phone back in the cloakroom and went upstairs and came back out, and someone had tweeted it and put in the article, and everyone was laughing. I was just like, oh, wow, cool. Okay.
That is so
And
cool.
so then that just kept happening, and they did definitely kind of make their way around. There was one day where I was talking to a photographer for one of the other news organizations who was there, who we'd never met, we'd never spoken. But she was like, "Oh, you made the sketches, didn't you?" I'm just like, "How do you know?
Yeah.
Like, what is happening?"
Yeah, really, really cool. Is FTX the coolest crypto case that you've ever covered? What is that story that you look back on and you say, wow, like that was a really cool moment of history in this space?
FTX was interesting, but I think the case I keep going back to every year is actually Quadriga CX, which I would argue was FTX, or at least had the signs of FTX prior to FTX. So, for your listeners and viewers, Quadriga CX was a Canadian crypto exchange, at one point Canada's largest crypto exchange, that went bust in 2019. The founder and CEO died under somewhat mysterious circumstances in India. There's actually still debate as to whether or not he truly did pass away. But the story goes that he passed away. He was the only one with access to his exchange's wallets. And so there was some $200 million worth of crypto at that time missing. I don't know what they would be valued at right now, but definitely a lot. Those funds went missing. The company had to file for bankruptcy. EY was brought in to try and find what they could. That case is actually still working its way through the Canadian system because first off, they're still trying to find if there's any assets left to sell. There's Canadian Revenue Agency is still looking at whether or not it needs to, assess taxes. There's still an investigation into, just how exactly this company collapsed 5 years ago. And then to add a little bit of fuel to this, early on when EY first took over, the company said it accidentally sent about something, I think it was 100 Bitcoin were accidentally sent to a hard wallet that no one had access to. And last year, those funds suddenly started moving. And no one, as of yet, knows who took those funds, whether EY actually sent them by accident or if someone went rogue, who has access to them now, just what's going on there. So that's one where I think there's a number of different takeaways for the industry, ranging from how are you looking at the exchanges that you're using? Are you trusting them? Have they demonstrated that they should be trusted? So, again, this is something that I think, for me at least, those lessons came up again when FTX collapsed and when Bankman-Fried was convicted last year. What are the systems in place to protect your funds? For example, Quadriga CX boasted that it had multi-signature wallets, but turns out that either that wasn't true, or at some point they went from a multi-sig wallet to one where just one person had control, or that one person had control of all the signatures. So there are all these lessons that, stem back to, again, this is 2019. This is 5 years ago. And we're still having these same conversations now about exchanges and wallets and protecting your funds and how you're handling and interacting with the crypto ecosystem. That's going to become an even bigger problem as we head into another bull cycle and we start seeing headlines about people making ridiculous amounts of money off of speculating in crypto.
Really well said. I mean, on a very frequent basis, I have friends and friends reaching out about, being a victim of pig butchering or a scam of some kind, or putting their funds in an ICO or even an exchange, as you said. And I feel like obligatory have to say, like, for much more, watch The Crypto King. That's the documentary on Quadriga. So what is the story that for you is like top of mind, the most interesting thing? I know we talked a little bit about DeFi regulation, about the sort of hacks in the space, as we rapidly get into the mix in 2024.
Honestly, I do think it has to be kind of, this development of everyone looking at mixers and their use. So tying everything together, the hacks, the potential regulations, the use cases, because this thought that I keep having is that, North Korea using Tornado Cash to launder stolen Ethereum that they took from Axie Infinity, for example, or whatever, to launder funds. That's kind of crypto working as designed. My understanding of the kind of philosophy behind the cryptocurrency sphere is, there's no single party able to block another single party from using it. And so what obligations is there, if any, on the industry to try and prevent this from happening? Where does that obligation come from? If the industry doesn't have some kind of, at least a conversation about this, probably not going to, lead to federal agencies and government regulators wanting to tamp down on it in, much stronger manner than they have so far.
Really well said. I like how you're approaching it, sort of like it is an issue that has so many different pieces to it, right? It's not just about mixers and what to do with mixers. It's this sort of really potentially critical question about privacy and security.
Absolutely is. It's a conversation that we're going to have. And I'm genuinely looking forward to it because it is fascinating, right?
Yeah. Thank you for joining TRM. Thank you for all the work that you do to bring us the news that we need and the insights. And yeah, looking forward to continuing the conversation. But thanks for joining TRM Talks.
Absolutely. Thanks again for bringing me on.
One of the reasons I love to have journalists on the show is you really get sort of this broader perspective on the ecosystem, because we all think we know what's important, but so much of that is actually influenced by the people who are writing. And my view of sort of the crypto ecosystem, and I think I'm pretty deep in the crypto ecosystem, is influenced by what folks are writing. So I really loved hearing from Nick on like, hey, what are you focused on? What are the issues? And of course, inevitably, especially around the regulatory issues, like, hey, he's focused on the things we're all focused on, and in part because he probably influences that. And I think it's really interesting to hear from him on what the sort of key issues are. The other really key takeaway for me was we're in a really unique space where regulatory issues are such critical news. And I think a lot of it is because it's such a nascent space that we're just sort of understanding what are the guardrails, what is regulation going to look like, not just in the US, but globally. So really cool to see from a journalist perspective what's important, but also just to talk through his perspective on the importance of regulation and why regulation is as newsworthy as it is today. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with Raj Mukherjee of the IRS to discuss the IRS's role in the crypto asset ecosystem. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.